see we've got 85 participants. That's wonderful today. My name is Chris Meinig. I'm director of the Coastal Sciences, part of Pacific Northwest National Lab in Sequim, Washington. And I want to welcome everyone to our joint Pacific Northwest National Labs and Scripps seminar. This is the third in our series. And today's one is going to be focused on extreme weather impact on socioeconomic and natural systems. And I wanted to start off, first of all, by welcoming everybody here. And to help our speakers and our moderator today, we're going to pull up a poll today. And if you wouldn't mind just sharing your job family, we're going to have Colette pull that up. And that'll help moderate our discussion, and we'll just get to know a little bit more about each other as we're on here to help frame the discussion for later today. So we're super fortunate to have two wonderful speakers and a wonderful moderator today. The run of show is we'll have two 15-minute talks, and then we'll have a moderated Q&A. And let me introduce the moderator of the session today, and she's going to introduce the speakers. So we're very fortunate to have Vanessa Bailey here today, who has a PhD in soil science from the University of Alberta. She joined PNNL as a postdoc in 2000 and has been a scientist and team lead, a group lead, and is now a laboratory fellow, which is the highest designation within PNNL. She currently leads the Department of Energy's Compass Field Program and Measurements and Experiments project, which seeks a process-based understanding of how coastal, terrestrial, aquatic interfaces fit within our Earth system. Very germane to the seminar that we're having today. So Vanessa, I'll take it over to you today to run the rest of the session today. So welcome, everybody.
Thank you very, very much. It's my pleasure today to moderate the presentations from two esteemed researchers, Dr. F. Martin Ralph and Dr. Nicholas Ward. Together, these two presentations are going to share current knowledge and insights to nationally important water management issues. From Dr. Ralph, we'll hear about those issues, and from Dr. Ward, we'll hear about the consequences of these issues. I'm going to start by introducing Dr. Ralph, and 15 minutes from now, I'm going to take a pause and I'll introduce Dr. Ward. So Dr. Ralph Marty is a meteorologist who studies the physical processes that create extremes in precipitation ranging from flood to drought. Notably, he's focused on atmospheric rivers and their role in mid-latitude precipitation events. Previously, he's been the chief of NOAA's Water Cycle Branch. He's chaired the Weather Research Program Executive Committee and joined Scripps Institute of Oceanography to create the Center for Western Weather and Water Extremes. Marty is a fellow of the American Meteorological Society. He's received the Climate Science Service Award from California's Department of Water Resources, and he's received several Department of Commerce silver medal and bronze medal awards for his science. So with that, Marty, I really look forward to your talk, and please join me in welcoming him. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Make sure I get this launched. Is that looking okay on screen there? It
looks excellent. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for the chance to be here today. I really appreciate the connections being built, and shared with the PNNL and Scripps. So I'm a meteorologist, and I was in NOAA for 20 years and then moved here about 10 years ago to start the Center on Western Weather and Water Extremes. And I want to share today some of our work on atmospheric rivers, a topic I've worked on for a long time, and relationship to water management stuff. So most of this is going to be on the atmospheric river topic, and then some on how that impacts water management. Just very briefly, this, of course, is a cyclone, extratropical cyclone hitting the West Coast, not far from your neck of the woods up there. And the thing is, this is a phenomenon we've studied in the field of meteorology for a century, and a lot of effort to figure out how these form and where the low pressure center is going to be and all that. But we've come to realize that there's a lot of important stuff happening in these storms that is very far from the eye of the storm, so to speak, the center down here, where these are streamlines coming out of the northwest, and then the southwest. The purple and blue is the moistest air. And that's where we see what we now know of as an atmospheric river. So the impacts of a storm like this on the West's water largely comes from what's happening in here, not what's going on up here. And one of the assumptions for many years was if you got this part of the storm right, the rest of it's going to fall into place, but it's just not the case. So we have focused for some time now, a decade or more, on the AR. Let me show you what one looks like in short. This was our Happy New Year greeting from Mother Nature this year. This is the water vapor content of the atmosphere with the winds at about 5,000 feet. You see the sort of linear structure here, the green, that's the AR. The winds are blowing straight on shore. That's pushing the water vapor up the slope. But to calculate that water vapor transport better, we use something called integrated vapor transport, or IVT, where we calculate the multiplication of the wind speed times the water vapor content at each altitude, and then add that up vertically. And it becomes essentially like cubic feet per second in the sky. And this is color coded by IVT, and the solid lines are sea level pressure. The vectors are the direction and strength of the vapor transport integrated vertically. And this is a strong storm. We can tell from the color scale here. What happens when that hits? What happened when that hit shore? Zooming in on California here, these color-filled areas, the reds are like 3 to 4 inches, and the oranges and yellows are 7 to 8 inches in 24 hours. The record all-time, that wasn't this storm, sorry, but the main point here, if you visually just connect where the AR was hitting and the map in there in the middle, and then you see it here, they correspond. This is what we see time and time again now. So what this means is getting the extreme precipitation location, timing, and amount right means you've got to get the atmospheric river right. And we have focused a lot on trying to, only from an individual storm standpoint do the ARs matter, but they add up to whether or not we're in drought or flood. And this is a diagram from 2019, a wet year, January, February, March. The color fill on land is the amount of precipitation anomaly. Blues, of course, are above normal, greens as well. And notice the colors of the arrows. Each arrow represents an individual AR at the location and orientation where it hit the coast at its maximum intensity. Usually they'll hit and they'll come down the coast away. So this is where they were strongest. And you can see a whole cluster of them off of California there, hitting California. Fast forward 3 years, the same 3 months, we had one measly AR1 hit California. Reds mean super dry. This is a terribly dry period for the Sierras, and a little bit wetter in the Northwest, but still below normal. So this visually conveys the basic message, is that active AR season, you get a lot more precip. Limited ARs, you don't get nearly as much precip. I'll skip that. This is what we had happen this winter, where we had a very active year. California was hit hard. The Northwest had a decent amount. So the white to light yellow is pretty near normal. But here you can see the sweep of blue and green across California and into the Intermountain West. Even as far inland as the high Rockies of Colorado, they get about 40% of their annual snow from ARs. California, much of California gets about 40 up to 50%. The Pacific Northwest gets around 30 or 40% per year. Arizona gets a big chunk as well. Because ARs can vary in strength and duration and impact, we've developed a scale at the request of the public, essentially. They want to know, was it a big one coming or not? And our scale has an interesting attribute that differs from other scales. We have 2 dimensions to it. On the horizontal axis is the time duration of an AR. So the AR ranking, as we call it, is calculated based on a location, and you determine what the strength of the vapor transport is over time at that location. Once it goes over 250 units, that's the intensity here. Once it goes over 250, we can qualify it as an AR. And if it stays over 250 for at least 24 hours, we then give it a ranking of an AR1, as long as the IVT maximum is below 500. If it goes between 500, peaks up at 600 or something, then we end up with an AR2. And if it stalls longer than 48 hours, we promote it to AR3. And so you sort of get the idea here. And this is now from paper Corningham et al. We looked at the economic impacts, relatively speaking, damages, 40 years of FEMA flood claim damage data. We aligned with whether or not there was an AR present the day of the claim of the damage or the day before. And we see this nearly logarithmic relationship between median damages and AR ranking. We didn't actually calibrate the scale according to the damages. This is a genuine, we did that based on first principles of what should be damaging, but the right-hand diagram shows that actually correlates well. Now, keep in mind, if we get an AR1 or 2 that hits a pretty dry area to begin with, it's usually pretty beneficial. And water managers are really interested in whether it's an AR or not, because they really add up to be a lot of the rain for the year and snow. And when we get up into the AR3s, though, in that range, we get this combination of hazard and risk. And we can even get, really big impacts from an AR1 if it comes right on the heels of an AR5. The AR5s are really super impactful. Normally, they'll cause quite a bit of impact. However, at the beginning of the wet year in the winter on the West Coast, before it's all wet in the land, an AR5 really can moisten things up without putting rivers over the banks. But once we get a saturated environment where the rivers are already high at the start, where lakes are high, then we can get to major floods. These are the billion-dollar disasters primarily are in these AR4 and 5 range. So this winter we had, zooming in on this 3-week period, what I like to think of as an onslaught of ARs. We had 9 in 3 weeks hit California alone. And the color scale here shows that 6 of them, 7 of them were at least strong or AR 3 or 4. And normally we might get at most in a whole year in all of California, that many strong ARs. So this was really a compact period of time of a lot of activity. And I'll show you a little bit more about what's going on there, or what went on. So this is now a visual display of a forecast of atmospheric river conditions. On the left panel, you see take at 40 degrees north. This starts where my cursor is at 0 days lead time, and then goes out to 1 day, 2 days, so on and so forth, out to 15 days. This is from the ECMWF model. And the color fill is the probability of an AR hitting the coast at that latitude at that time. So for example, right here, let's go to this one. We got this reddish color at 37 north, so right in the Bay Area. On this 9-10 January, which was about a week ahead, there was about a 80% chance, 90% chance of there being at least a minimal AR. And the amazing thing here is you can see 5 ARs lined up. And already there'd been a couple that had hit, so the landscape was quite saturated already. This was of concern. And this product is being used extensively by a number of people and organizations to get a heads up in the AR framework as to what's coming from a probabilistic standpoint. One thing we do to try to improve the forecast of ARs on the short lead times, like 1 to 5 days, is we fly the weather reconnaissance aircraft the U.S. has in its arsenal traditionally for hurricanes. We're now using them in the hurricane off season for AR recon. And I've led the development of this, and I'm the PI on it, and work very closely with the National Weather Service and the U.S. Air Force and the NOAA Aircraft Operations Center. And what you see here in the bottom is this translucent object is the AR. The ARs typically are down in about the lowest 10,000 feet above sea level, about 3 kilometers. And that's where the vast amount of the water vapor transport's happening. And we go and slice and dice that with the aircraft using these drop sounds. You can see a little picture of one here. And we also use satellite data with airborne radio occultation. We leverage the buoy network that is out, the drifting buoy network that normally is there for precise sea surface temperature and ocean current measurements. We add sea level pressure to those. So that's a nice partnership. And we sample the heck out of these. And normally the other data sets are not able to do that at all. And what we've found is now we've ramped this up in the last few years from just a pilot study in 2016 to a major effort with almost 40 dates this last winter, where we flew up to 2 aircraft a day. This is what the tracks looked like on 1 day on the left there. And you can see the aircraft on the right. And then these are the tracks during that 13-day period where we flew every day, at least 1 aircraft, sometimes 2. And we know that when we fly back-to-back days, the data have an even more impact. An example, and this is a statistical version of this and all, but in this very tangible example, here's the high precip is the purple, and that's the observed. This is what was predicted with the US model when it included the drop sounds from AR Recon. And when it excluded the drop sounds, you see it just missed that. We have statistical results on this that show very positive impact, and there's a whole slew of journal articles showing stuff like that. Another thing we're doing is improving. We've developed a tailored atmospheric river focused model, regional in the WRF framework. So we call it West WRF. It's here at our center. And the fact these lines are curving down shows us the model's improving. This is the root mean square error of IVT. So this is basically the AR intensity. And we're getting forecasts much better in the most recent couple of years than several years ago. And this is obviously a result largely of the fact that research can be used to improve the forecast skill. In addition, how far ahead can we see these things coming? This is a little bit complicated diagram. This is lead time now on the vertical axis. This is different date. And now what you see is The purples here, like in this case, we see the nearly 100% agreement of the models that out to 5 days, there was going to be an AR hit, and we could see it like 5 days ahead. Even at 10 days ahead, there was a hint of like 70–80% chance, which is remarkable. That's about as far out as we see this sort of thing. But what I want to point out is for this onslaught of 9 ARs, in the bottom diagram where the red goes above the thin flat line, that's the AR designation based on the IVT magnitude. So each of these different ARs largely had substantial lead time, heading up towards 5 days, where we had at least in the 80% range chance of seeing this well ahead of time. So there's forecast skill with these ARs, and that's what I want to turn to now to close out my short briefing. Is we're working now with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and local water agencies and state agencies to look at the possibility of those skillful AR forecasts helping with reservoir operations. And here's keeping in mind that Army Corps of Engineers dams historically have not been able to use forecasts. It's always decisions are based on water on the ground. In other words, a reservoir operator has to look at the rain gauge, the snowpack, the stream flow, or the reservoir level, and those are used to decide what the releases are every day. Instead, now the option exists to bring in forecasts, and we're working hand in hand with Army Corps of Engineers on this, funded to pursue this. I'm the chief scientist on it, and it's run out of the Engineer Research and Development Center of Army Corps of Engineers. And here we see the pilot study area. We worked on Lake Mendocino in the northern end of the Russian River. It's just about 150-mile long river. But the point is, this river, this lake, and this area is very prone to drought and to flood. So the water control diagram, it's called, this dashed line, this is shown for the water year, shows the allowable water storage in the reservoir. So when the AR came along here in 2012 and put the water up into that flood pool, it's called, another AR came. They were required to release that water down here in case there was another storm coming. But as this one didn't, formed a team with colleagues, and we hypothesized that if the forecast could be skillful enough, an operator of the reservoir could potentially look ahead, say hold the water here at this level where the green dashed line is, hypothetically, 10,000 acre feet more water than they would otherwise, and then wait a day and wait a day and wait a day. And what ended up happening is we hypothesized this to the point where you could carry that water into the summer if no storm hit. And that would have, in this schematic idea, allowed for 20,000 homes worth of water for a year, that 10,000 acre feet. What happened in reality is now we've proven it out. Within a few years, we got that proven, and the proof is in the pudding or in the water behind the dam. And here is the real case from this winter, where in 2020, late 2022, the reservoir was at its lowest level. This is storage in the reservoir. This is date over 3 months to the end of February. And this is that onslaught of ARs filling up the dam. The red line is the normal top of conservation pool. This all is flood pool. But with FIRO, we've developed a way to identify a FIRO pool, which gives the reservoir operator flexibility within that range to keep the water level there, depending on the forecast. And you can see they did exactly that here. They brought it right back down to the top of the FIRO pool. Well, what happened after this late February timeframe is we got another batch of ARs, and I want to show you what happened. So this is the previous diagram I just showed, and now we're looking farther into the spring. And what you see is the reservoir operator actually released a fair bit of that water, anticipating a storm, and then it refilled, and they were able to rebalance it and carry all that water back into the summer. Once again, a major amount of additional water supply available for the winter or for the summer. And this on the left is what happened in a drought year 3 years earlier. Very similar result. This is a case where this location, the forecast skill of ARs is good enough, and it ends up increasing water supply reliability, which, and this is my only nod to the biology, a key thing this river does is it sustains 3 endangered species of salmon. And having cold enough water through the hot season is really important for their survival. So this is enabling a recovery of endangered species through a biological opinion that the local water agency and the Army Corps have to address. And then finally, I'll just share that we're doing multiple reservoirs now, including up in Washington. We started one recently, and we're looking at very different environments, from coastal to urban to rural to snowpack dominated to Sierras and Cascades, and also in Santa Ana Basin here in Southern California. And I'll close with this picture from Scientific American, which I published a year ago. And it tells the story in short way and common language about the forecasting of atmospheric rivers, about the scale, about forecast informed reservoir operations, and about AR recon. Thank you very much.
One thing about these virtual presentations is you don't get the abundance of applause. So Marty, let me say thank you, and you deserve a ton of it. That's one of the most powerful images I've seen in a long time, and I look forward to reading the article. I'd like to urge everybody to, if you have questions, to put them in the chat. I will be reading questions for both Marty and Nick in the final 15 to 20 minutes of this session. It's again a pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Nick Ward. Nick is an aquatic biogeochemist who has extended his expertise to span biogeochemistry of coastally influenced systems from both marine and Great Lake waters through sediments, soils, and vegetation. Nick's got particular expertise in how carbon and water flow together through the Earth system. And since joining PNNL, he's focused on how hydrologic disturbance alters these flows. Having worked with Nick on many different projects, I can personally attest to his ability to collaborate with different domains to enhance predictive models. In 2022, Nick was made a fellow of the Association for the Sciences of Limnology and Oceanography. And just 2 weeks ago, he was announced as the winner of the Thomas Hilker Early Career Award for Excellence in Biogeosciences from the American Geophysical Union. Nick, your slides look fabulous in presenter mode, and I will turn it over to you. Just a reminder to everyone to put questions for both in the chat, and I will field them at the end of this presentation.
Great, and I'm not muted. All right. Thanks for the great introduction, Vanessa and Marty, for the excellent talk on extreme events. So I'm going to talk today about a DOE-funded program called the Compass, and I'm going to zoom into one specific activity of this project, really focused on trying to understand how ecosystems will respond to extreme events such as the atmospheric rivers just described. I should note that Vanessa, our moderator, is the PI of this project, and Chief Scientist Pat McGonigal out of the Smithsonian guides a lot of our research. This is a large multi-institutional project with 7 different national labs, universities, and federal entities like the Smithsonian. I'll highlight this image here that's showing the calm before the storm, and I put artificial storm because today we're going to talk a bit about some ecosystem scale manipulation studies we're doing. I'm going to start out with just some introduction to Compass itself. So the overarching vision of Compass is to develop a mechanistic understanding of coastal ecosystem function to support scalable, process-rich modeling. The motivation for this project really started back about 7 years ago through a DOE workshop called Research Priorities to Incorporate Terrestrial Aquatic Interfaces in Earth System Models. Following up on that report, we've identified some key gaps in our global climate models in that we don't actually represent the coast. So our current cutting edge Earth system models tend to have land, a river going into the ocean without much happening other than water transport, and then an ocean. And so when we're at the coast, we might have a cell that's half ocean, half land. That's oversimplifying it a bit. But our grand vision is to help establish the ability to represent the finer details of coastal ecosystems at that global scale. Some of the big questions we're trying to tackle are: what are the fundamental ecological, biogeochemical, and hydrological control points that govern the structure, function, and evolution of these coastal interfaces, particularly under changing hydrological conditions, rising sea levels, intensifying storms, and drought cycles as well. And then how do these control points interact across multiple spatial and temporal scales? And what interactions are most important to improving predictive models that can cross scales? I threw out a word, control points, which can mean different things for different people. We've taken our own sort of definition to mean, in one sense, a permanent control point is something that must be represented at a subgrid level. So if you have a pixel that represents the coast, we're positing at this point in our research that you must at least represent open water, wetland systems, upland systems and the transition between them in a Earth system model grid. Now, in terms of activated control points or processes that are driving biogeochemical fluxes, these are essentially the equations that need to be in that model. So we work at some very fine scales. I'll, at the end, kind of loop you into the different types of models we use. But ultimately, we need to figure out what processes have to be elevated to the global scale. We probably need tides. We probably need salinity. Are things like methane cycling important to represent at that global scale? So those are the big picture questions we're trying to tackle. And again, I want to emphasize that we really are focused on the transitions between coastal uplands and wetlands, as well as wetlands and open water, and understanding how carbon, nutrients, and other geochemical constituents are transported and transformed across this continuum of upland systems out into the open water environment that you may think of more frequently when you hear the word coast. We work across two different regions, the Great Lakes region and the Mid-Atlantic, really with the goal of embedding transferability into our research and yielding data that highlights diverse coastal behaviors and parameters. We want to know how well these models work across diverse environments. Is it even feasible to represent every type of coastal region with one model? So that's the type of thing we're exploring in the next 10 years or so. We have study sites that we monitor frequently. We have networks of sensors. I won't talk about that today much. And we also do frequent fieldwork at all of these locations. Today, I'm specifically going to highlight two ecosystem manipulation studies that we're undergoing. The first one is taking place on the Chesapeake Bay, and it's located at the campus of the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center. And that's actually the experiment I'm going to talk most about today because it's the most mature and it's been going on for about 5 years now. We're also in the process of setting up a new experiment in Lake Erie, which I only have one slide on that because it's really in that nascent ideation stage. Before I move on, one interesting thing to think about in why studying these two regions, obviously one is freshwater and one is brackish. The Chesapeake has tides as most typical coastal systems, whereas the Lake Erie, which we're focusing on in the Great Lakes region, does experience quite dynamic hydrological variability. We get wind events that drive seiches and water moving back and forth between the two sides of the basin. In terms of long-term change, we have the sort of monotonic sea level rise on the East Coast, steadily rising sea levels, whereas in Lake Erie, we have decadal scale shifts that are on the order of magnitude of many, many years of sea level rise. So for example, in 2020, we have a sort of record high water level, and now we're on the decline. And these rates of change in the lakes are an order of magnitude faster than that creeping sea level rise. So really dynamic systems. We see similar features across the two when looking at the ecosystems. We see forests transitioning into marsh, except in the Great Lakes, it might go the other way in the future. So that's to set the stage for the remainder of the talk. I'm mostly going to talk about this experiment that we've named Tempest, or the terrestrial ecosystem manipulation to probe the effects of storm treatments. The goal here is to really understand how extreme events, like the types of atmospheric rivers that Marty talked about, or in the case of the East Coast, hurricanes, storm surge, and large rain events impact coastal upland systems. So what factors will result in eventual shift in the state of this upland system? So you see an aerial image of the location here. We're studying this forest just adjacent to the estuary, the Road River estuary in the Chesapeake Bay. In the bottom, you'll see an example of some of our experimental plots. And without going into detail of what's all being measured here, you can see we're measuring quite a lot of different components. Really, we're trying to integrate geophysics, hydrology, biogeochemistry, ecology, and any other field that I probably forgot to name right then. Quite active site. When we're out doing an experiment, you might see 20 people walking around with different instruments, measuring a whole host of different things in these plots. Really, the novelty to us in this experiment is that it allows us to make real-time observations of shifts in environment and ecosystem states and biogeochemical functions that are typically inferred by space for time studies. So for example, typically I might go to a ghost forest or a transitioning forest and take a core of that tree and understand when that tree started suffering and when it died. So we're really over more at this right side of the picture here in terms of observational studies. There are very few, if any, studies looking at how we go basically into the unseen ecological responses, those sort of initial responses of the system. And that might include subsurface soil responses happening before the trees are even feeling much suffering. So again, our goal is to monitor this system for the next 10 years and continue pushing it towards the right side. We might not get all the way to the furthest right, but we would like to understand sort of that initial stress of the system. So it's quite an engineering feat. We have large tanks that can hold massive amounts of both seawater and freshwater. So I didn't describe yet, we have a control. We have an estuarine water plot where we pump water from the adjacent estuary and irrigate that plot. And then we have a freshwater plot that we irrigate with freshwater, trying to tease apart the difference between soil moisture and salinity impacts, basically. We've collected about 4 years of preliminary data, mostly funded on an internal investment by PNNL, and then initiated our first treatment experiment last year. This summer, we put 2 treatments, and those treatments involve basically flooding the site for a day. So 2 years ago, we flooded the 2 plots for a whole day. And then this year we flooded both plots for 2 days in a row to try to see how different that response was, and if there was sort of the antecedent conditions drove different responses in subsurface biogeochemistry as well as above ground biology. Again, like I said, we have a goal of continuing this experiment for a long time to see how this system will respond along similar timeframes of, say, sea level rise. Going into some of the data we've collected. So this is data from our first treatment 2 years ago, where we simulated essentially what was equivalent to a 15-centimeter rain event that saturated the entire rooting zone. So the water came all the way to the surface and actually flooded the plots, as you can see in this picture. This also introduced salt, obviously. So looking at the top plots, this is showing volumetric water content. You see in our freshwater plot, this big pulse in water content, as well as our estuarine plot. And actually, we just happened to have a storm the day after our storm treatment, which was kind of funny. So our control plot also experienced not flooding, but soil saturation. We were able to raise the groundwater level. So measuring water level in wells, we saw the groundwater table come all the way up near the surface in both of those plots. And looking at, for example, what happened in that control due to a natural storm. So really, this was a major event. We estimated how impactful it was compared to a recent Hurricane Ida. And both the extent and duration of soil saturation were about twice as large as that natural hurricane that occurred. So we're really replicating a very extreme event. This bottom right figure, you'll see groundwater salinity, where we've risen the salinity of the system up to about 3 parts per thousand. And note that the seawater we're using is around 8 to 10 parts per thousand. So it's not pure seawater in this case. That salt lingered around for a while, and it's having long-term impacts, like I'll show you on the next slide. So one of the immediate impacts we saw in differences between the seawater and freshwater flooding is what carbon came out of the soil pore water. When we've added salt to the saltwater plot, all of a sudden the pore water DOC became much more mobile. You were releasing different types of carbon, which would travel down the system. We actually had surface runoff. I don't think I have a picture of what I've called Compass Creek, but water running off the plot, which we're going to characterize in detail this coming next summer. But quite interesting, this response persisted throughout the year. So we added some salt and changed the ionic content of the subsurface. And the entire year, that system had much more mobile DOC, fundamentally changing the carbon cycle of that subsurface environment. We didn't see that same change in the freshwater plot, other than that one day, maybe we mobilized a bit more carbon, but nothing persistent like in that estuarine plot. I want to highlight Allison Meyer's pig, great work studying this phenomenon. And we're also doing some lab experiments to try to understand in more detail what are the mechanisms of this release. So you'll see here, for example, a soil sample that we washed with salt water followed by DI water and releasing more and more colored organic matter. Oops. I should probably speed up a little bit. Another big change we saw, and in this case, it was almost the same change in the 2 flood plots, was anoxia of the soil environment. So these yellow colors are 0 oxygen. Essentially, we turned an upland system, which is typically oxygenated. So looking at the control plot, it's near atmospheric saturation and oxygen most of the time. We made it completely anoxic over the course of 2 days. And again, the response to the second flood was almost immediate. It took a while on the initial flood for the system to convert to basically wetland conditions. But now on the second day of flooding, it was poised and ready to stay anoxic. We also had redox sensors in the ground, and these blue colors are showing a shift in the redox state. So essentially now the biogeochemical processes in the subsurface are going from aerobic carbon oxidation down the redox chain through iron reduction, sulfate reduction, and even to the point of methanogenesis, which we did see. So here we're looking at soil greenhouse gas fluxes. Typically, the system, this top plot is methane uptake. Typically, these forest systems take up methane. After our disturbance, we actually saw methane produced in both the freshwater and estuarine plots, reducing that net carbon sink of the system. I should note we did see higher levels of methane production in the seawater plot, and I'm hypothesizing that has something to do with the more mobility of the carbon pool that I described in a previous slide. I'm not showing the data here, but we also measured greenhouse gas fluxes from tree stems. We saw an increased flux of CO2 from the tree or increased stem respiration. And we also saw a switch to methane emission from that tree stem, probably reflecting the subsurface conditions, methane coming up the root system. One last data slide, we looked at a variety of plant metrics. I'm only plant performance metrics on the trees. I'm only showing two. We actually saw a decrease in net photosynthesis in the estuarine plot and an increase in photosynthesis in the freshwater plot. On the right, I'm showing stomatal conductance, or the gas exchange of that tree. And we saw a decrease in gas exchange in the two plots. As a whole, these data show us that the whole tree hydraulic conductance decreased, and that was likely linked to the hypoxia inhibited root uptake. So we have hypoxia throughout the rooting zone that's inhibiting the ability for the trees to use water. Now, along with the observed increase in stem respiration, particularly in this estuarine plot, these results suggest that there was an overall decrease in the tree carbon balance following flooding, particularly in that estuarine plot. So just to kind of wrap up, I didn't talk anything about modeling other than at the beginning and the end. This was too short of a talk. I wanted to share some exciting empirical results. But really how we use this data is we use coupled model frameworks starting from molecular scales. So we can use, for example, genomics to inform the reaction networks that happen in reactive transport models such as pFlowTran or Aquamend. And really we use different models to move up different scales. So at the scale of a lab experiment, we might use something like this, which is you can put in as many reactions as we want. As we start going to a scale of like these plots that I talked about, we might use these sort of subsurface hydrology models like the Advanced Terrestrial Simulator and couple some components of the chemistry, probably not all components of the chemistry. Ultimately, our goal is to bring this up to ELM, which is the Earth Land model in DOE's E3SM exoscale energy Earth system model. And so the work we're doing on COMPASS is really to provide this mechanistic support to understand what needs to be represented at that ELM scale. I'm a minute over already, so I'm just going to briefly say we're in the process of planning a new experiment in Lake Erie, where the size of these plots is going to go up 2 orders of magnitude. So we have the rare opportunity of diked and managed wetland systems in Lake Erie, where we've gotten to go ahead to basically flood this entire, I can't remember how many hectare plot, but taking the Tempest plots to a whole different scale and move a lot of water. With that, I'll say thanks and put up some pictures of the field team.
Again, huge applause. Thank you so much, Nick. I really appreciate the effort both you and Marty put into putting together such interesting presentations. Again, I'm watching the question and answer for any real-time questions that come up. We also have some questions that were pre-submitted that I'm going to share, and then I'm probably going to take the liberty of asking a couple questions of my own if we have time. So we're going to spend the next 15 minutes or so having a discussion with questions. At the very end, there will be a final poll that we're going to put up just to kind of move things forward and prime people for the next presentations. One of the comments I do want to share, I'm not sure whether there's anything to be discussed here, but I thought it was interesting. Jeff Mawson, it would be interesting to use forecasted atmospheric rivers to implement impact reductions from stormwater runoff of non-point and source point on nearshore marine ecosystems, particularly during first flush events in urban areas. So that's a comment rather than a question. But Marty, did you want to respond in any way to that, or?
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense that if we know what's coming, especially on the finer spatial scales, even a few hours ahead, there might be some mitigating actions that could be taken. We have a project with one group that is deals with combined sewage discharges, and that's really what's driven the requirements there.
Interesting. This is a pre-submitted question. It may be a little bit more directed to Marty, but Nick, I think your background in oceanography could be interesting as well. But somebody posed this, and I'm going to read it as it was written. Am I imagining this, or is it really possible from climate change? The past few years, it seems that West Maui and San Diego have exchanged weather conditions. The most extreme example was Maui hosted a firestorm while San Diego hosted Hurricane Hillary.
Well, we do see things flip around from time to time. I'm not going to say climate did it per se, but it is a remarkable shift that they remark on.
Interesting. Nick, I have a pre-submitted question that's more targeted to you. And one of our attendees would like to learn about how natural habitats in coastal and estuarine systems can be made more resilient to climate change.
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know if I have a great answer, but understanding how these systems function and respond to change, I think probably all of us aren't a fan of things like armoring and whatnot. Putting up a wall isn't the way to make them resilient. I think probably, the applied science restoration ecology world we should integrate what we learn across the two domains in terms of fundamental and applied ecosystem work, where I think some of the tools that we're using, like Fates Hydro, I didn't describe, but it does vegetation responses. Some of these tools might be beneficial to planning for resilience. And on the flip side, I would say some of the tools that we already use for planning resilience would be useful on the fundamental side. So that was a wishy-washy answer to a topic there.
Marty, did you want to comment a little bit on that? Because I know I loved your phrasing, the water in the air versus water on the ground, but it seems to me that you're considering both.
Yeah, it really is. And we've got a lot of work going on in soil moisture monitoring, which I think is quite interesting in this arena, both for the ecosystems and for the hydrology and response. It's amazing that in so many years ago, I started noticing that in the fall, and anybody in probably paying attention notices it too, you get a heavy rain and it lands so dry that the rivers don't even budge. And then it takes a couple of those storms before you get water showing up in the river. And it was on a field trip where I was able to go out with our team. We were installing our first soil moisture sensor as a center here. And we went out with shovels and all that. And turns out the hillside that looked nice and smooth, golden grass and all that, perfectly level, was actually super bumpy because it was full of cracks, big enough cracks in the earth that I could stick my hand in up to my elbow. That was obviously where the first 10 inches of rain were going, was straight into those cracks. And then eventually they would expand because it must have been clay or something. And then the next storm, finally, after that's all filled in, the soil's expanded, then you get the ton of runoff. I had never imagined it being so tangible about what's going on, but I can imagine the plants and all, responding as well.
Thank you. As a soil scientist, I hope you have photos of those because I'm going to hit you up later.
Whether I can find them is the question. I definitely took photos.
Thanks. We have another question that's been provided in real time. What sort of timeframes are required to, say, restore present low groundwater levels in California to those of 100 or so years ago, assuming average rainfall for many years? I'd add, is that even possible?
Well, that's a big question, isn't it? So first thing, and I'm not a groundwater person at all. And Nick, if I misunderstood, if you want to take this one, that's fine, but I think I might be closer to it. One thing I've learned is that there are certain groundwater sort of aquifers where once they're, the water's been pumped out, they sort of collapse a bit, and it's sort of a one-way door. and it's hard to restore. But there are definitely substantial areas where water can be recharged into the groundwater. And one of our FURO projects with Orange County Water District, there's a partnership with the Army Corps of Engineers and the dam there, that when there's enough water in the bottom of the dam, which is normally kept empty essentially for flood control entirely, but there's a little bit can sometimes be held for a little bit in the bottom, they can release that at about 300 or 400 cubic feet per second. And the Orange County Water District can use recharge basins to get that back into the groundwater. And our FURO effort is trying to create more opportunity for more volume of that. And it's looking very promising that we can achieve that. So some people are starting to call flood managed aquifer recharge. A version of that would be FURO-MAR, which is exactly what's going on in that case. Pretty exciting development, honestly. Recovering the whole groundwater system to 100 years ago, that's a whole nother person's expertise required.
Interesting. Nick, no pressure. Did you have any thoughts on that, or we can move on to, there's a question more focused on your presentation also.
I think Marty handled it well.
Thanks. I'm going to hop over just to give Marty a bit of a break. Another real-time question, compliments to both of you for a great presentation. But what are some of the observations from studying the flooded plot of land with salt water that low-lying islands should keep in mind with sea level rising?
Yeah, I'll take a first stab at that. I mean, there's obviously different aspects to consider. One of them is if you're using fresh water locally, that's a big deal. And if you have salt water intrusion into the aquifer, that would be probably a first order impact on communities. In terms of sort of just like the landscape scale response, I didn't really highlight it because it's still kind of prelim findings and we're doing some experiments in the lab, but salt impacts on the landscape are fundamentally changing the soil structure as well. So we're beginning to see some cracking, kind of like Marty alluded to, in that upland plot that's 10 meters above sea level. And we're taking some soils in the lab and watching basically the soil structure decompose when we add that salt. So in terms of just the ability for infrastructure to exist, it's something we need to think about with salt increasingly coming onto these landscapes. Like we've shown one event, if there's one big storm surge on that island, it could change what's happening on that island for a whole year. So I think there's a lot of sort of management considerations that I don't know much about, but just in terms of landscape structure and the plants that hold it together, I think the effects of even one big event that in an area that hasn't experienced it can be very large.
Thanks. It seems to me that just listening to the previous question, your response here, that recovery times, we can talk a lot about impacts of these big events, but recovery times is a whole different theme for maybe future presentations. A couple more questions. What is the state of integrating? I think this is Marty. What is the state of integrating El Nino, La Nina intensity and the corresponding impacts on atmospheric rivers? And then Nick, this might be interesting on physical sediment transport in rivers. Any thoughts on the potential impacts of this upcoming El Nino winter on the West Coast and the Pacific Northwest California? So.
All right. I can take a crack, Nick, unless you want to start.
Right.
First of all, yeah, El Nino's in the air, it's in the media, it's in people's minds. There's been a lot of sort of science in the past that showed that strong El Nino tends to be wet in California, dry in the Northwest, La Nina reverse of that. And big question often is how are ARs related? And the pad answer is, well, it's because the El Nino changes the storm track, which changes where the ARs go, and they contribute to those anomalies. The super interesting recent thing, though, is after several years of this, now seeing the last few cycles of La Nina and El Nino here from a Southern California perspective, it's sort of gone opposite. And we've had a couple of La Ninas that have turned out wet, like last year down here, super wet, and a couple El Ninos that have been, well, bust. And I've started to think that ARs are the disruptor of the correlation between El Nino, La Nina, and Southern California precip anomaly. And we have a postdoc now doing that analysis, and the results are confirming that essentially. So at least in the case of Southern California, It's more that ARs are the disruptor, because if you have a La Nina and it's supposed to be dry here, all it takes is a couple good AR storms to get through the barriers of the weather, and we end up in a better place water-wise. And if it's El Nino, but the storms El Nino points our way aren't ARs enough, then we don't get enough precip to be as anomalous as expected. So that seems to be what's happening here. Whether that's true elsewhere remains to be seen, but we're figuring out the methods right now to explore that.
Thanks.
Awesome. I'll add something on the sediment transport. And hey, Brent, me and Brent went to undergrad together at UCSD many years ago. So yeah, sediment transport occurs largely during big storms. So in the Northwest, for example, something like 80% of the sediment loading from a lot of our rivers happens during fall storms. So, you know, your annual sediment budget can be pretty closely linked to how much rain you're getting that year. And so, yeah, El Nino and atmospheric rivers, just like Marty talked about, will have a big impact on the water balance and the sediment balance.
If I could just add, there's a nice bit of work by someone named Ned Andrews, USGS, about 20 years ago with the big El Nino in '98. I happened to be part of that, and it looked at the sediment transport in California. It was shocking, the massive fraction of all sediment transport to the coast that came in just a handful of storms over a century.
Interesting. I have one more online question. I'm going to take the liberty of closing with a question from myself, and then we'll do the poll. So the online question is probably largely pointed at Nick, and it's an interesting one. Can we learn anything from the estuary flooding of the lagoon where Venice, Italy is located, as that area has been flooding for hundreds of years? So you've talked about the Great Lakes and the Chesapeake Bay. Let's bring Italy into this.
And I know very little about how Venice handles its lagoons and inland waters. They have built a lot of infrastructure to be able to maintain buildings and society right there in the water. I don't have anything insightful to say. I'm sorry.
You actually do. I think what you just touched on is the fact that there's a legacy of infrastructure management to accommodate, if not mitigate, these events.
Will Miami need to adapt like Venice has as water starts coming up through the karst? I think we could learn some lessons probably.
I don't know. I just know that whenever I get asked why we do coastal research, our answer is always because that's where people live. And I think that's the heartbeat of that question really is this is where people live. Yep. I'm going to close the question period with one question from me. And this is for both of you. And I'm going to put you on the spot a bit. We've heard about the inundation from atmospheric rivers in the Western United States and sea level rise in the mid-Atlantic. Both of these are resulting in major flooding events. Can the two of you briefly imagine in 1 or 2 minutes how what you've each heard from each other could enrich the impact your own research has on our nation? So we'll start maybe with Marty and think about, some of the consequences and studies Nick's talked about. Is there a way to amplify your work? And then Nick, you get the luxury of following him.
So I'll just start with an interesting question. And the thing about the coast that in a common sense way, I imagine I'll probably be wrong because I said that, is that, the high water levels end up to be this combination of conditions from the ocean with tides or storm surge, or on top of that, waves. And then you've also got the outflow from the rivers, meeting in the estuaries, and that sort of combination is complicated to model. I saw in Nick's presentation some very interesting displays that looked like there are people working hard on that, including the interface to the ecosystems. And I can imagine there's a lot of potential, like Nick was saying, where you have even one inundation can change the soil structure, that, it's a threshold phenomenon essentially. And those things combined, just like the water level itself is a threshold thing, because if you get all three things lining up at the same time in a king tide or whatever, watch out. Over to you, Nick.
Cool. Yeah, that's a good question, Vanessa. And I think I'm going to go back to a question I was asked on a recent tour I gave here, which was, so what happens if we can perfectly model these coastal systems? And really, the more insight we gain on how the natural systems work and the ability to predict how these natural systems work and respond, I think us as humans have that ability to with more information, both not only restore systems to their natural state, but also harness these natural systems for their beneficial reasons. So one example, we had a seminar on marine CO2 removal research, I think in one of the last webinars here. And so really to understand how humans can go manipulate the positive things about these ecosystems, like the ability for the ocean to take up CO2, we really have to understand the natural processes. So the types of modeling work we do on COMPASS and other fundamental science projects, I think it's really setting the stage for a new future where we use the beneficial outcomes of ecosystem processes to help mitigate human emissions.
Thanks so much, Nick. I really appreciate everything you guys shared today. In the final 3 minutes, Colette, would you please put that final poll up? This is the audience's chance to influence what upcoming discussions we're going to have, just like this. So the simple poll is, what are your ideas for future Scripps Institute of Oceanography, PNNL lunchtime webinars? Just put a few topics in. I can see all kinds of ideas that I'd like to throw in, but it says that I can't vote. And so I look forward to hearing from this. Again, one of the comments we had just noted these were professional presentations beginning to end. Well done, greatly appreciated. I want to thank you both. It was fascinating. I think this is an important venue to start sharing the complementary research we do and hopefully stimulating more research ideas and identifying ways to answer the nation's most pressing questions. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for attending and thank Nick and Marty for their efforts to entertain and educate. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Good day.